we knew exactly how you'll probably hear that we've arranged for an appropriate soundtrack to accompany this meeting, the drilling outside. If you want to add to the soundtrack, you can turn your mobiles on so that they ring occasionally, and so on. Now, the title of this meeting is Growth in the Planet. It seems to me that there are two parts to this question. One is the planet being killed, metaphorically? And the other is, if so, what is doing it? Who's the murderer, as it were? And the first part of the question is simpler to answer, and I'm going to deal with it quite briefly. As in any detective story, identifying an act of murder is relatively straightforward. It's finding the killer that's the more problematic bit. It takes rather longer. So I'm going to start by asking the question, is the planet being killed? And I think the answer very clearly is yes. Human beings are using about 50% of the planet's plant growth, of Earth's plant growth, about half of it's usable fresh water. It's taking the biosphere around a year and 3 months to replenish what humanity uses in a year. Sometimes referred to as our ecological footprint. Returning resources into waste at a much quicker rate than nature can transform them back again, if you want to put it that way. There are various ways in which human beings are killing the planet. Too many for me to go into. I'm just going to focus on one which strikes me as being potentially, by far the most important, potentially very devastating indeed. For those at the back, there's a couple of seats. There's 3 seats at the front, there's a couple there. Nobody minds if you come forward. I know that many of you will know the science of climate change inside out, and so I promise to be very, very brief and highlight a couple of aspects of it. The basic science of greenhouse gases creating global warming has been known since the 19th century. Reading some of the debates with so-called climate skeptics, you find that hard to believe. But the basic facts have been known for that long. Now, what's relatively new to the picture is an increasing awareness from paleoclimatological evidence of changing climate in the Earth's past, that climate change can happen very, very abruptly in geological terms. My favourite way of illustrating this, I know some of you have seen it before, apologies for that, is to use this graph of temperature changes in the last 500,000 years and carbon dioxide changes. The information has been gathered from the drilling of ice cores in the Antarctic, at a place called Vostok in this case. And what you can see from the graph is that it's supposed to take this with me, aren't I? No, too bad. It starts round about the present and goes back 400,000 years. And what you notice a few things. How jagged it is, how incredibly quickly temperature can rise. Here's a 12-degree rise within the space of just 1,000 years or so. Sometimes it's risen even more quickly than that, a few degrees within the space of just 50 years, human timescales. You notice also quite a close correlation between carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide graph and the temperature graph. If a 12-degree rise doesn't sound huge to you, after all, that can be the difference between a morning in London and an afternoon. Consider this: the mini ice age that saw the River Thames freeze in the winter, such that you could roast oxen on it. Around about Shakespeare's time, the average global temperature then was only about 1 degree Celsius lower than it is now. So the average translates into huge changes. A rise of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 degrees, which is quite possible thanks to human-induced climate change, would be absolutely devastating to the planet in terms of crop failures, in terms of diseases, in terms of water on water resources, etc., etc. Huge, hundreds of thousands of people have been dying already because of climate change. Vast numbers more could die because, and this is particularly because of the feedback mechanisms involved. As you'll notice that carbon dioxide and temperature change roughly in tandem. Same applies to some of the other major greenhouse gases, such as methane. And that's partly because as the temperature rises, Earth's biosphere releases more carbon dioxide and methane in a positive feedback loop, thus accelerating the initial temperature rise. And there's a real danger that if human beings continue to pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, a very severe temperature rise would occur as a result, thanks to the feedback mechanisms. I don't have time to go into all of those mechanisms. We can in the discussion if you're interested. So, there's the prospect of huge problems for the human species. After all, you'll notice that the temperature at the far right of the graph has been very, very stable for the last 10,000 years. Coincidentally or not, in 10,000 years of human civilization have developed division of labour, cities, and so on. And that could change very, very quickly. You'll also notice that the carbon dioxide level on the far right is about 285 parts per million in the atmosphere. That graph only goes up to about 1950. Since then, it's risen to 388, which, if you can't see so closely, is about up here on that graph. So things changing very, very quickly, and the planet is getting killed. The rate of species dying out is about 1,000 times background rate. We're looking very seriously at the prospect of one of Earth's great species wipeouts taking place. There's been 5 or 6 of them in the past, depending on in the geological past, depending on how you see it. But it isn't very likely that another one is in train. So the planet is getting killed. Who is the murderer? The finger is often pointed at economic growth. There's been a lot of debate on this in recent years. The debate as such isn't particularly new. It goes back a long time. But during the great post-war boom in the 1950s and 1960s, the overwhelming dominant view was that economic growth is good, it provides the key to ending poverty, to increasing human happiness, to increasing human freedom. I'll give you a couple of quotes to indicate the kind of views that were common currency at the time, and still are to some extent now. This is from Arthur Lewis, the great Caribbean economist, first black man to win a Nobel Prize in economics. Economic growth, he argues, as you can see, is the key to enabling humankind to gain greater control over their environment, and that brings about an expansion of human freedom. Further to the left, a different angle could be found. In addition, John Strachey here, a social democrat from the 1950s, he argues that the aim of policy must be to turn our marvellous productive resources, onto the task of indefinitely raising the standard of life of the whole population of the world. And again, these views are common currency today. However, already at the same time, in the 50s and 60s, a critique was beginning to emerge of these dominant positions. Writers such as John Kenneth Galbraith and Herbert Marcuse are cases in point. I think the classic statement of this, perhaps the most famous one as well, was this one, which I had up on the screen as you came in. The idea that economic growth in itself won't bring a virtuous society, a happy society. Gross national product doesn't measure very much that directly tracks society's well-being. It counts air pollution and cigarette advertising, ambulances to clear our highways of carnage. It counts the destruction of the redwood and the loss of our natural wonder and chaotic sprawl. It development, napalm, and nuclear warheads, etc., etc. And the same speaker goes on, but the gross national product doesn't measure the health of our children, the quality of their education, the joy of their play, the beauty of our poetry, and so on. It doesn't measure our wit, our courage, our wisdom, or our learning, nor our compassion, nor our devotion to our country. It measures everything in short, except that which makes life worthwhile. The same speaker added, and it tells us everything about America except why we're proud that we are Americans. This was Robert Kennedy. Interestingly, he was an advisor to his brother JFK, who was one of the great apostles of economic growth. If we lack a first-rate growing economy, we can't maintain a first-rate defense. Was a classic JFK type quote. Anyway, I don't know what the conversation over breakfast between those two involved. But the point is that the type of critique of the growth fetish that you can see coming from, in this case, Bobby Kennedy, has become standard fare on the left these days, minus the American kick. A very good example is Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett's book, The Spirit Level, which some of you might have attended a meeting on prior to this one. And by the way, if I can just plug SWC's journal, the International Socialism Journal, is an excellent interview in this current journal. It's just been brought out, which is on sale, an interview with Wilkinson and Pickett. Now, they, through a series of meticulously researched graphs and data, they show that even within world capitalism, the societies which have greater income equality, such as Finland, Norway, Sweden, are societies where people's health is better, social well-being is better, as opposed to those such as Britain and America. America almost off the charts there. You can see a little dot on the top right, which are much less healthy and much less socially content societies. Their research suggests that as national income increases beyond a certain level, it ceases to improve human health and human happiness. What does affect well-being much more is the degree of social equality. More equality leads to less anxious, less stressed societies, societies with greater well-being, happier societies. And they add, it's fortunate, they conclude, it's fortunate just when the human species discovers that the environment cannot absorb further increases in emissions. We also learn that further economic growth in the rich countries no longer improves health, happiness, or measures of well-being. So this means that the argument about economic growth producing human happiness, that I quoted John Strachey earlier, has to be qualified, in some cases severely qualified. As to the other argument, the one by Arthur Lewis, the argument that economic growth gives rise to greater control of the environment, it also requires severe qualification. To some extent, it's redundant, at least in the version given by Arthur Lewis, thanks partly by climate change. Economic growth is actually leading to the decreased possibilities of human control over the environment. Greater control over the micro is giving rise in a sort of anarchic way to reduced possibilities of control over the macro. I think we can probably agree most of these points, but other people go quite a bit further. In recent years, or in the last couple of decades, there's been a growing argument for a politics of degrowth, the championing of degrowth as the way forward. It's become something of a movement in some countries. In Italy and France, it was prominent debate in general election campaigns a couple of years ago, for example. So degrowthers, essentially Greens on the political spectrum, for degrowthers, the enemy is productivism, whose evil twin is consumerism. And to give you an idea of the types of arguments that they're putting forth, I'll just give you a flavour. I'll give you some quotes from a couple of leading proponents of the degrowth position. One is the American ecological economist Herman Daly, who argues his emphasis is on sustainable development requiring change of heart, a renewal of mind, kind of cultural revolution. There's a sort of Christian inflection to some of his thought, as you can see from this quote. And I was taken by his identification of Moses as a potential early environmentalist. His 11th commandment would have read, "Thou shalt not allow unlimited inequality in the distribution of private property." I think corporate lawyers could make a bit of can make mincemeat of unlimited. It requires a bit of rephrasing, and perhaps an addition of the 12th commandment, which of course was "Thou shalt inaugurate workers' control of the means of production." Anyway, there's a certain social democratic element to many of the degrowthers, such as Herman Daly. Another one is Serge Latouche, French thinker, essentially a green, a bit more anti-capitalist in his views than Daly. His book, Farewell to Growth, happens to hark directly back to Andre Gortz's Farewell to the Working Class. They're similar thinkers in many ways. Unfortunately, Gortz famously brought out Farewell to the Working Class in 1968, just before the May general strike, the biggest general strike of workers in history. So I was a bit worried when this book came out. I thought maybe an extraordinarily steep rise in economic growth would take place immediately thereafter. Anyway, some of Latouche's positions you can see on the screen. We, human beings, have become addicted to the drug of growth. We need to, various policies, we need to build taxation into the costs of transport and other things to include pollution therein. Localization of production of world trade, revitalization of peasant agriculture, and reduced working hours. For the third world, he argues that, at least in rural areas, village self-sufficiency is the way to go. And he's critical of what he calls the development ethos of especially Western aid agencies and third world states seeking to build health and education facilities to improve people's living standards. There's a quote from Latouche to indicate that point. Now you can describe some of this, at least in Latouche, as a sort of deep green, verging on the deep green or the dark green, or romantic philosophy, if you will, or to its detractors, a primitivist position. And from that type of dark green position, there's a clear opposition can be drawn. Oh, excuse me, I've just missed a slide, quite an important one. Just rewind a second. One further quote from Latouche, where he's criticising the use of vast quantities of energy freely supplied by the planet Earth, devalues human labour, authorises endless predation of natural wealth. The result is an artificial abundance that destroys all sense of wonder in the face of the defects of the creator and the creative skills, creative abilities of human skill. So, a dark green perspective coming in here. And from that dark green position, you can you can see the politics essentially pivots on a dichotomy between what can be called productivism or just detractive primitivism. You can, on one side, it's pro-growth, pro-globalization, privileges the large scale and the high tech and the scientific, and a relevant book from this position is called Small is Stupid. The reply to too much of small is beautiful on the green side of the dichotomy, with all its other characteristics there on the screen. This type of dichotomy, by the way, isn't limited to degrowthers such as Latouche. It's much more pervasive in modern Western culture. If you think, for example, about recent interest in the Na'vi, who are nowadays by far the best known of hunter-gatherer societies. Many of you will know of the Na'vi. For those who don't, I'll briefly summarize. They're hunter-gatherers, organized in clans. They practice an animistic religion, profoundly connected to all other life forms. They lack formal science, and they have very sophisticated handicraft skills. Here's one of them. This is one of the characters from James Cameron's Avatar. This one looks just an image of someone I met at Climate Camp last year. But, anyway, Avatar revolves around the story of the human race burning up its planet and seeking elsewhere, finding a planet called Pandora, very symbolically, where there are valuable minerals to be obtained. One of the minerals is called unobtainium. And the humans plunder the planet and building strip lines and roads and so on, and pissing off the Na'vi, who see no need for economic growth because they live in a steady-state economy. Anyway, I won't pursue this digression too far, but the point I'm making, as much as I love Avatar, here's a photo that summed up the human side, industrial, high-tech, etc., with our hero in his wheelchair at the front. Right. Much as I love Avatar, I think that the philosophy that it represents is skewed, built on this productivist, steady-state degrowth dichotomy. I don't think socialists should join either camp, the productivist or the primitivist. Both are ultimately personifications of a bad abstraction. The bad abstraction being the idea that growth is a concept with a general socially relevant meaning. The productivists are blind to the environmental havoc being created by unsustainable production. The primitivists are unable to relate to the struggles of workers and the poor to defend living standards against cuts. They can't address the desires of people in the third world for better transport, electricity, and so on. We're at Marxism, so a relevant question is what was Marx's views on economic growth? Did he use the concept of growth? Well, not really. He speaks of the growth of capital, the growth of trade, the growth of industry. Never as growth as something in itself, never something general to be supported or condemned. You might be thinking, what about the productive forces? Marx's concept, or referring to the ability of human beings to labour cooperatively, the techniques they can draw on, the science they develop, and so on. But here we can see from these quotes that Marx and Engels, already back in the mid-19th century, were very keenly aware that what they called the productive forces were being developed in an incredibly one-sided way by capitalism, and for the majority of the population were becoming destructive forces. So there's no productive force championing in any simple way in Marx. Another quote from Capital: capitalist production only develops the techniques and the social process of production by undermining simultaneously the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the worker. Marx wasn't alone in this type of view. The Bolsheviks shared it by and large, especially Bukhari. The Bolsheviks, that was 1917, early 1920s. Then something happened. And I think it's summed up very well, this time again by Arthur Lewis. Economic growth, says Arthur Lewis, played little or no part in the blueprints of socialism which were drawn in the 19th century or earlier. No part in the writings of any leading socialist before the 1920s. And what happened in the 1920s? Well, a number of things. Stalin coming to power, for one thing. It's Stalin, he argues, who realized early in his regime the blueprints he had inherited weren't compatible with the economic objectives he sought to attain, and so he promptly discarded the blueprints. Of course, it wasn't only Stalin and Stalinist movements such as Maoism that were developing along these lines, but social democratic governments too, governments that were essentially about subordinating socialist movements to capitalist imperatives. And when we talk about capitalist imperatives, what are we referring to? Well, partly economic growth as a core goal and ideology of capitalism. Like any society based on exploitation, capitalism requires ideology to justify itself. Its goal of production in capitalism is the self-expansion of capital. Its motor is profit. That's how it works. In reality, the capitalists themselves don't want to see the system in that way. And also, on top of that, they have to pay attention to other layers in society. In the early period of capitalist development, there was a general, rather vague sense that governments should preside over economic improvement, particularly so in Britain. But there wasn't this modern sense that maximising economic growth was an urgent, continuous and primary goal. That came later in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. Why? Well, society was democratising. With universal suffrage, ruling classes were forced to pay more attention to the demands of workers. At the same time, in the late 19th century, states were beginning to intervene much more vigorously in economic affairs. And economic and geopolitical competition were becoming fused. The age of imperialism, as Marxists refer to it. States were becoming, in this sense, economic actors in their own right, competing against one another. And national income growth was the index of a state's virility, of a state's competitive success. In the 1930s, all these trends came together, and on top of that came the success of the Soviet Union, success measured in crude economic growth terms. For the other powers in the world, Russia came to symbolize the need for every state to keep pace. It was in this decade too, the 1930s, that national income accounting was born, the idea of gross domestic product as a measure of economic success, or gross national product. And GDP, problems with GDP as a measure of well-being are often seen as accidental, as sort of a product of perhaps something too difficult to assess, or perhaps the person designing it just got it wrong. Seen as accidental in that sense. I would argue it's simply a matter. GDP isn't a measure of society's well-being. Why not? Because it measures commodity transactions within a particular territory. It's a pretty good proxy, therefore, for capital accumulation in that territory. But the well-being of capitalism, not the well-being of society. It's a measure of the bare stamp of capitalism. That's the symptomatic bit. It's not accidentally wrong because it's reflective of capitalism in which it, as a measure of a yardstick, is born. After the Second World War, this trend towards economic ideology of economic growth resumed with greater force. In the 1950s, full employment and its companion, economic growth, became a key policy objective for governments the world over. GDP became seen as a proxy for the profitability of the national economy, and as a sort of magic wand to wave at all sorts of goals. The goal of preventing a return to the Great Depression, of putting an end to poverty, of defusing class tensions, carving a path for a state to international recognition, of beginning the transition to socialism, all sorts of goals it was supposed to serve. In the last 20 years, 30 years, with neoliberalism, economic growth has taken a bit more of a back seat. It's declined from its peak, but it's still very central, and it still exerts a profound influence on the left. Just a couple of weeks ago, Brendan Barber, the CDC General Secretary, was talking about the economic crisis, and was arguing the solution to it is of course, growth. With growth will come more crumbs from the table of capital to improve living standards for the workers. Now, I would argue in context that the slogan of socialists should be defending living standards, involving ourselves in struggles and campaigns, improving the confidence of the working class, confidence to fight for improved living conditions. But beyond that, for a social society in which not profit and growth are the goals, but quality of life is central instead. So just got a couple of minutes left, so I'll just sum up with much more to say, but I'll sum up with a few concluding thoughts. First of all, continued capitalist growth will kill the planet, metaphorically. Look at the figures on the screen. If the logic has interest. If gross domestic product grows by 3.5% a year, it grows by 31 times over 100 years and 961 times over a century. If you want to visualize that figure, 961. If somebody is about this height, if that's economic growth at the start of the 200 years, following the 200 years, it will be the height of Ben Nevis. And if GDP growth involves increasing material and energy throughput, then that consequently will reap irreparable environmental damage. So obviously we need to build a sustainable economy. Technological solutions that help. Most technology is there, all the technology is there, but technology isn't nearly enough. Radical social transformation is required. The utilisation of renewable resources needs to be such that they can be regenerated, and that they're not used more quickly than the ability of the planet to regenerate them. The use of non-renewables needs to be at the rate in which they can be replaced by alternative renewable resources. Some things do need to grow. To state the obvious, especially in the third world, electricity, sanitation, water systems. Also in the so-called rich countries, or in the rich countries, the quality of life for most people can be and should be improved greatly too. There's enormous scope for improving quality of life in a sustainable way. A lot of thinkers have been working on this. One of the classic recent books is George Monbiot's Heat, which shows how this can be done. One that some of us in the Socialist Workers' Party are involved in is the Climate Jobs Programme, which develops ideas as to the programme as to how the British economy can be transformed, involving the creation of 1 million climate jobs, which will improve people's well-being, above all for the unemployed and their families. Above all, in terms of housing, which can be immensely improved and rendered more sustainable at the same time. Immensely in transport, quality of life in our streets, in our cities, our health, and all of which can be done at the same time as radically reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Similar are possible in agriculture and food. So this type of program, I think, is crucial in terms of offering a way of improving society's well-being and at the same time preventing dangerous climate change developing. It's crucial also for the immediate movements that we're involved in, for preventing, for instance, the environmentalist move, the environmental movement becoming essentially a sort of middle class sacrifice espousing ghetto to which the bulk of the population would only react with repulsion if they feel that they're being asked to tighten their belts in the same ways as the condemned government are doing at the moment. Anyway, I've run over time, so I just want to finish by plugging this pamphlet. It's available for sale around Marxism. There's a stall from the Campaign Against Climate Change that sells these. And also there's a climate change caucus that people would like to come along on Sunday, but we can give you information about that. Thanks very much.
Okay, we've got plenty of time for a discussion, and if people want to put their hands up, then I will call you, and I will ask you to come to the front for this, just like with every other meeting. The meeting is recorded and you need to speak in mic. So So if you keep your hands up, please.